John Chancellor Award for Excellence in Journalism. And the idea of this prize is that it honors not just a single piece of work, but the sustained excellence over a person's career. And it honors the legacy of the NBC News anchor, John Chancellor. Our two guests tonight are exceptional reporters who are so deserving of this award. They cover two critical stories, civil rights and climate change. And the reason that one of them is wearing a tuxedo, the other one is wearing gala wardrobe is that they'll both be honored shortly after this at a ceremony across the way at the Low Library. I'm going to briefly introduce them both, and then Sheila and Laura will be doing a little Q&A, and then I think that we'll open up to questions from you all in a minute. Jane Mayer, more immediately to my left, is a staff writer and investigative reporter with The New Yorker, and she's the author of the new best-selling book, The Dark Side. She's being honored for her depth and detail for reporting on the Bush administration's war on terror. Her reporting constitutes the definitive account of the inner workings of our country's efforts and our decision, and the government's decision to strengthen its oversight at the expense of civil liberties after the 9/11 attacks. She chronicled the administration's use of extraordinary rendition, the CIA's secret black site detention program, and uncovered the paper trail that established legal decisions made by the White House, which ignored the Geneva Conventions and sanctioned abusive treatment by the White House against terrorism suspects. I should also mention that she's a finalist in the National Book Award, which is also going to be given out later tonight, so she has a lot going on. And finally, I would also just say something. I took a moment to look at the Amazon page where her book appears, and it's one of those really interesting books where you look at the reader comments, and there are about 90 comments, and I think 80 of them give her all 5 stars, and 10 of them give her 1 star, which is a sign that it's a book that really hit a nerve. But I was looking through the reader comments to see kind of what the gestalt was, and there was one that was particularly evocative that said, if you truly seem to love your country, you must read this book, which I think, as praise for an author, is about as good as it gets. Also to my left, wearing the penguin suit, is Andy Revkin. See, I can say that because I'm not going to the dinner. So, he, as many of you know, he's the science correspondent for the New York Times, and he's also a very well-honored alumnus of this school. He has won the Chancellor Award for his decades-long coverage of science and the politics of climate change. Interestingly, he began reporting on the human impact on the environment about 20 years ago, long before most journalists even recognized it as a problem. Today, his work on climate change and global sustainability has set the standard for environment reporters everywhere. Throughout his career, he's focused on the challenge of providing energy to the growing human population and its effects on the atmosphere. At the New York Times, he exposed efforts by political appointees to alter climate reports in the White House and their attempts to silence NASA scientists' views about global warming. He's also, I should note, a true multimedia journalist. He uses multiple platforms to do the reporting about climate and development. He has a blog on the Times called The Earth. The most recent entry is something about the World Toilet Day, which I'm sure he might explain in a moment. He does podcasts, he shoots photographs. He did an amazing video series from the North Pole not too long ago. I really encourage you to look it up. So we're very happy to have both Andy and Jane here, and we're so grateful that you could spare some time to talk to our students and faculty. So we don't have a great deal of time, so I'm going to turn it over to Sheila, who's going to get us started. Thank you very much.
I'll start off with a few questions to Jane. Okay, so Jane, reporting on national security on the war on terror has been one of the most difficult and challenging areas for reporters during the Bush administration. Because of the administration's penchant for secrecy, its refusal to reveal records, the reluctance of sources to talk. How were you able to do these stories? How did you overcome these challenges? How are you able to cultivate the sources and get the information you need despite this very restrictive atmosphere?
Let's see if this, you guys can hear me, or should I just shout? I'll just talk. Can you hear me in the back if I talk loud? No, okay. Well,
I think this one goes.
hello? Hello? No. Okay, all right.
But you have to pull over closer.
Did the CIA do the same?
Okay.
I feel like a crooner here. Okay.
You build it.
Building trust is kind of the key to it, and I think that one of the things a lesson for certainly any investigative journalists out there is, I don't know.
Want you to go to the podium?
Hold on, that's what I did.
Okay, this seems great. I can't overemphasize the importance of building the trust of your sources and protecting them as well, which means being smart about placing phone calls not to their workplace, figuring out ways to meet people in person, trying to get documents so that you don't have to require people to go on the record in order to prove the authenticity of events, and basically guaranteeing that you will protect them in every way possible, because there are a lot of consequences for people who've gone on the record and had to, take risks for their careers. And so I think you have to, it's not just a joke or something to, sort of a kind of a movie version of something like Deep Throat. It is actually quite a serious thing at this point, and you really have to be very serious in how you take care of the people who will stick their necks out and talk to you. So it's something that's very much on my mind. I was actually, at one point, I became the focus of a leak investigation, as did some of the sources that I talked to. And it is incredibly chilling, which is what the lawyers call it, but chilling it really is. It's very, very hard to work under those circumstances, and I found a number of the people who I'd interviewed would no longer speak to me because I was so kind of radioactive at that point. So it is difficult.
At the time when the courts were pressuring journalists to reveal their sources, what sort of assurances can you give your sources about anonymity, about
I think the other thing is to always be completely honest with your sources, and you have to say to them, I've said to them, I'll go to, the last mile in order to protect you, and we've got terrific lawyers, Floyd Abrams and others at the New Yorker, but, you can't really tell at the end of the day whether the courts are going to compel someone to talk at this point. But, you have to be careful. So, I try to make assurances that are always honest, basically.
What stories were you not able to write because of the restrictions, because of the restrictive atmosphere? And would you
that I
not
can
be
tell
able
here,
to,
but I can't.
And would you not be able to write them, do you think, once a new administration is in place?
Well, to me there are many mysteries still, and I'm waiting to see whether in the Obama administration we'll be able to get to the bottom of them. Some of the dots have yet to be connected about who authorized what and how in terms of torture in the War on Terror. We know that there were psychologists brought into the CIA who brought in a curriculum of torture, sort of psychological and physical. We don't know yet who brought them in. I'd really like to know who hired them, whose idea was this to reverse engineer a training program in the military that studies torture defensively and turn it into the curriculum and the program of the United States. So I would like to see that. I would like to see also the notes of some of the national security meetings where torture was actually discussed by cabinet members in front of the most powerful people in the country.
Do you think this information would now become available in the new administration?
I fear that the sound of shredders whirring is the background right now. I don't know. I'm not sure. I think this is it depends, in my view, on what the public demands at this point. And I think that if the public really wanted to get to the bottom of these things and see what happened in its name, that there might be a little bit of starch in the spine of Congress, which would then hold hearings like the Church Committee hearings. So far, the public's been pretty quiet about this. And if the politicians don't feel the pressure, they'll sweep it under the rug.
Projecting into the future, what changes do you think will take place in the national security arena in terms of policy, in terms of access to more information, in terms of the whole preventive detention, military commissions, etc.?
Well, hopefully the fact that Barack Obama was a constitutional law professor means that he will understand that there are limits to presidential power, and that's how the system was designed. And so he will no longer say the president is above the law and can, for instance, violate the torture statutes, which literally is what happened during these last 8 years. So I think there will be change, but the problem in American history is always when there's fear, people do the wrong thing, and that's why journalists are needed to point it out.
Will we see the closure of Guantanamo, for example?
I think we will see the closure of Guantanamo. It's a sticky mess. I mean, what happened was once you take people outside of the rule of law, you can't really bring them back in. They violated these people's rights to such an extent that if they were brought into a regular criminal court and had a decent defense lawyer, most of the accused would be able to get off simply because of the way they've been treated, locked up for 7 years without access to a lawyer. And so it's going to be really a difficulty. And there are some seriously bad people down there, Khalid Sheikh Mohammed and others. And I have a lot of faith that the courts can handle terrorists as criminals, which is what the rest of the world does. But in the cases of the people whose rights have been violated, it's complicated. And so I think it's really interesting to see. It's just a colossal mess to be cleaned up.
Okay, thank you, and we'll open you up to
Glad to be with you.
questions later.
Thank you.
Okay, let's actually, it looks like this end of the table works.
Find out.
We should probably get the World Toilet Day question out of the way first. What is it, and how did you end up writing about it for those who didn't read the blog today?
About 4 or 5 times now. In the course of .earth, it's been going for about a year. Basically, the blog explores how we head toward more or less 9 billion people on a single planet with the fewest screw-ups, the fewest regrets. And one category of regret is the real-time things that are happening in the world right now that happen every day that kill millions or prematurely take the lives or create serious illness for millions of people on the planet. It's totally avoidable. And one of those is the lack of a place to take a dump. And there are 2.6 billion people right now on planet Earth who have no secure, safe, sanitary place to do that. And it makes, actually I ran a video on the blog that UNICEF had put together. I was just so amused by it. It's called Poop is Funny but Fatal. And it starts out with kids telling poop jokes because we all laugh at it. And the problem is it's a serious issue. And so World Toilet Day is put on by the World Toilet Organization. The head of the World Toilet Organization has a house shaped like a toilet. I think he's in the Philippines. But in the piece, actually, the headline talks about flying toilets. And what flying toilets are, if you go to the slums of Kampala, Uganda, people would rather not pay a penny or two to go to the ridiculously unsanitary latrine down the street, so they use plastic bags. So you have plastic bags of stuff flying around the slums of big giant cities. And so flying toilets is what the blog was really about. It's about a book, too, that just came out about all this, a very interesting book by Rose George.
Your blog, .earth, launched pretty much a year ago.
Yeah.
How has it changed what you do for better and for worse? If for worse.
For worse is it basically, blogging envelops every spare cubic inch of your life that you don't push back against. So it's just constantly sort of coming in at you. I need to check the comments. Something just happened that's bloggable. I could write something on that blog 5 or 10 times a day if I physically was capable of doing that. Because it's a very busy, complicated world with a lot of stuff happening on the road to 9 billion people. So it's horrible in a way. And then I'm trying to write for print. I'm trying to, as much as I can still, and balancing all that is a challenge. But as I'll be saying later at this award thing, we're headed toward this brave new weird world where the web, the front page is being replaced by the home page. And if you're not willing to do that kind of interactive journalism, then you're probably going to get left behind.
Had you had any multimedia?
Did I mention the upside? The upside is the interactivity. The upside is that it's a two-way street. Ideas have come that way, and readers have value. My readers are all around the world. Actually, I'm supposed to head to the Amazon in December, and there's a guy who lives like 50 miles from where I want to go, back to where Chico Mendes lived and died. And he's and I wouldn't have ever met this guy if it wasn't for the blog.
Had you had any multimedia, and what did it take to sort of start thinking that way after 2 decades in print?
Well, I even when I was here at the J School way back in when they had a dark room. Anyone know what a dark room is? Yeah, cool. I love photojournalism all along, and actually I love film. For as long as I've thought about writing, I've also done photography too. So, and I started in magazines. When I got out of J School, the first place I went was Science Digest magazine, then Discovered. So I grew up journalistically in a realm where pictures and words are part of a package. And so for me, the migration to the web is just another step along that line where you have animation and slide shows and video clips and all that stuff.
The other thing that's happened sort of simultaneously with the launch of the blog and the new media revolution, if you will, in the news media, is that your beat area, which I can imagine 20 years ago was sort of viewed as a specialty niche, is suddenly front and center. And that must be gratifying.
Gratifying, sort of. I'm very, well, all journalists are show me people, and I see this burst of interest in green, this, that, and the other, and even my own newspaper trying to put together a green conference that it canceled now that the financial markets have collapsed. And, so I wonder, I look around and I say, well, how much of what's happening now is different than what happened in 1988, which was the first year that global warming became a big story. And I do think a lot has changed, and I'll be talking about that later, but the science has solidified tremendously. But I don't think people have adequately absorbed what will need to happen to have a world that's 80% dependent on fossil fuels, grow toward 9 billion people, and become 80% free of fossil fuels, at least an emitting form of using them in a couple of generations. It's an astonishing thing. We've never had to move away from a convenient, cheap energy source in our history as a species. We've always moved from firewood to coal and oil because it was better, way better, than having to lug firewood up to an apartment in Chicago. You can't do that. But coal, you could put it in a furnace and have steam. And so this is a huge transformation that would need to happen. And I would like to see more evidence that people are seeing, and the government are serious about that.
Just as science has been viewed as sort of a specialty corner in newspapers and the media for many years, science journalism has been viewed as something, you have to have special training to do. If we have students interested in becoming science journalists, what background do they need?
To my mind, looking back, I think, I just have a biology degree, and I worked during college. I worked summers for Marine Fisheries Department in Rhode Island, so I kind of understood how science, the process of it. The best possible training to cover science is to take a course in the history of science. Not a course in physics, but a course in how science works. Because the thing that society has lost track of completely, I feel, is that science is not just some set of facts that have accumulated on shelves magically. It's a body of information that's living, dynamic, and always evolving, and always under challenge. And so you're not befuddled when you see skepticism about some facet of global warming to think that means we don't know anything about global warming. If an informed society or a journalist who understands that science is a journey looks at dispute, it's very different than dispute over a bill on abortion rights or something. It's a normal part of how science progresses. It's an attack process, it's a winnowing process, it's a challenge process, and that's normal. But it doesn't mean at any one particular point along that journey you don't know anything. And too often our journalism on this kind of issue has ended up perpetuating that false sense of, well, someone disagrees with someone, therefore we don't know anything, therefore we can sit on our hands and relax. So that's the thing, just process, understanding it's a journey. And that doesn't take, and then asking good questions. Even the more training you have, actually, the harder it is to ask the dumb questions. So John Wilford at the New York Times, who just retired, got 2 Pulitzer Prizes along the way, wrote, Man Walked on the Moon Today. He didn't have any special expertise. He just asked good questions and knew how to write.
Well, how about dealing with scientists who are sometimes an intimidating bunch for particularly young journalists who don't have a lot of science background?
Well, yeah, what I just said was sort of idealistic, but you do have the ability. If some scientist is not granting you time or not returning your phone calls, you could say, hey, guess what? I'm paying your bills. the National Science Foundation, I guarantee, or the National Institutes of Health, or some other body of federal money that that taxpayers have contributed to is the reason they're able to do their work. So they are obligated. In fact, under the NSF rules now, even when a scientist writes a grant, 20% of that effort has to go into outreach. And so you say, hey, I'm the outreach.
And obviously, climate change is the biggest story on your plate right now. But looking ahead, what do you see coming down the pike? Do you expect to be writing about this 10 years from now, or is it going to be
Groundhog Day, Groundhog Day, Groundhog Day. My coverage has evolved. Climate change is not the story of our time. Climate change is a subset of the story of our time, which is that we are coming of age on a finite planet and only just now recognizing that it's finite. So how we mesh infinite aspirations with a species that's been on this explosive trajectory, not just of population growth, but consumptive appetite, how can we make a transition to a sort of stabilized and still prosperous relationship with the Earth and each other is the story of our time. And it's a story about conflict. It's a story about the fact that there are 1 billion teenagers on planet Earth right now. 130 years ago, there were only 1 billion people altogether, grandparents, kids. Now there are 1 billion teenagers, and they could just as easily become child soldiers and drug dealers as innovators and the owners of small companies in favelas in Brazil. And little tweaks in their prospects, a little bit of education, a little bit of opportunity, a microloan or something, something that gets girls into schools, those things, that's the story of our time. And climate is like a symptom of the story of our time, meaning our energy choices right now come with a lot of emissions of greenhouse gases, and if we don't have new ones, we're going to have a lot of warming.
Okay. I think we wanted to leave time for some members of the audience to ask questions as well.
This question's for Jane Mayer. Your book basically comes out and says that war crimes were committed by high-ups in the Bush administration. Do you believe that these people will be prosecuted?
Well, I'm not a lawyer. I've interviewed a lot of lawyers, and they are the ones who tell me that war crimes were committed. I don't really know. I think that it's a political question again, and the question is really whether the country. I think it's whether the public demands it again. I kind of tend to doubt it, I have to say, and I think it's very possible that Bush will issue some kind of blanket pardon before he leaves office, and if he doesn't, I think that there may be some kind of bipartisan commission to study what went wrong that will take a really long time and then come up with a study. But that said, there are still some very tricky legal questions hanging in the balance, which are that some of the people, for instance, that were renditioned by mistake, the wrong people that were renditioned to innocent people, have tried to bring charges against the United States for being locked up in dungeons. And those cases have yet to get any kind of satisfaction through the U.S. courts, partly because the Bush administration has argued that it's a threat to national security just to have these cases argued in an open court. But I think that's about to change, and if those people really get into the courts and can try to bring their complaints, I think that there may be damages and some kind of legal repercussions there. So.
This is also for Jenny Mayer. I was wondering to what extent your access to sources was possible because you were working for the New Yorker. What if you'd been a freelancer? Would people have been interested in talking to you?
I think it helps a lot to be at the New Yorker because it has a reputation for being so careful and accurate. And I don't find though that doors fly open without a lot of begging still. I'm sometimes amazed that I can be this old and still basically tugging on people's pant cuffs for a living to try to get them to talk to me. So, which is what it feels like a lot of the time. I think it helps that the organization I'm with has a very good reputation. I'm just trying to think though whether there weren't some great stories that were broken by people from, no-name organizations. One of the things that's interesting, I was listening to this discussion about how the web changes our reporting, is that one of the things that was interesting about the stuff that I've been writing about is that it's very international. So an awful lot of the stories on the so-called, torture, rendition, interrogation, all those detainee issue stories started in places like Pakistan with little tiny squibs in newspapers that then, because of the internet, get sent around the world. It's been like an international relay race where somebody sort of takes the baton, writes a story, and tosses it to the next country. So anyway, but basically, I'm very happy I'm at the New Yorker. I think it does help.
Hi, this question is also for Ms. Mayer. I wanted to thank you for writing The Dark Side. As an American, I found it very challenging to read. I found myself getting very emotional and having to set it down for periods of time and then pick it up again. And I wondered what your experience was writing it. Did you have those same kinds of challenges?
Thank you for that nice comment. For the most part, it didn't get to me too much because, in truth, I had such a feeling that I know what I need to do here. This is a story that has to be told, and I felt I really had a purpose, which you don't always have. I've had that feeling being a mom, and I've had that feeling every now and then on a great story. I know what I have to do. So I felt, I really had some use, which was great. And I had a few bad dreams about torture. Most of the material didn't get to me because I didn't get to meet an awful lot of the people who went through these things. I did find at one point I sat down for a cup of coffee with Khalid El-Nasri, who was a German car salesman who was renditioned by accident. His name was much like somebody else's that they meant to be renditioning. And it's different when you're face to face with someone. He started to cry, and it's always when someone starts to cry that it really gets to me. So, but most of these people, a lot of them are still locked up. So I didn't have that kind of personal interaction.
Hi, this question is for Andy, actually. And I was wondering, with the current financial crunch in newsrooms, where does that leave science journalism and those of us interested in going into the science field?
There are many niches in journalism that are going to have a harder time with the imploding prospects of having a big staff. And science, the growth in science is persisting in the health coverage. Coverage of medicine, healthcare is growing, even as the overall enterprise at the Times is shrinking, our science staff. And of course, we're the last of the last of a newspaper with a big science staff to begin with. So if you're thinking about a career, I would recommend focusing on medicine and wellness. And as a science journalist, seeing the full range of what's interesting and important to society, I feel sad about that. But realistically, there are changes afoot. The other approach is just to be sure you can flex all those muscles, and then when you get a chance, once you're on staff somewhere, you can do whatever you want. When I started out at Science Digest magazine as a copy editor, exploiting all the skills I learned here as a copy editor, which was, I don't know who, they still have the basic copy editing class where one of the tests was watch those verticals, I-L-I, but that's my one bit of advice. If you're getting hired somewhere as a copy editor, watch for the verticals, because that's what they always throw, that's where they throw you the loop. Get in the door as a copy editor and then start writing about herbicides, which is what I did at Science Digest, and I got a national award for this story I did on paraquat. It was my first feature story for a magazine in 1983. So just get in the door, do well-being reporting, write about yoga, and then become an investigative reporter and write about rendition.
I have a question for each of you guys. Tonight at the John Chancellor
Well, I may have met, let me think about this, 81, 82. I went to the Goddard Institute for Space Studies when I was a journalism student here. It's right, it's the corner of 110th and Broadway above Tom's Restaurant and all that stuff. And I probably brushed shoulders with him at that time, although I didn't write about him while I was here. I wrote about another scientist there studying the dust between, in outer space, in between everything we know about. And he was a fascinating character too. But Jim Hanson I first reported on in 1988 when global warming really sort of hit the headlines. He testified at a hearing organized by Senator Tim Wirth at that time, on a hot day where they intentionally kept the air conditioning off in the hearing room, and this is how Washington works. And he, from that point on, has been someone I've spoken to, written about, quoted. My first long magazine story on climate change in Discover magazine, October of 1988, 20 years ago, led off with Jim Hanson testifying at that hearing. And just, of course, in 2006, I wrote this set of stories about him being pressured not to speak, which was a doomed enterprise. Anyone who's ever met him knows that he's not going to not speak about something that he cares about. And I've watched him evolve I've watched him tread into this difficult terrain where scientists feel so frustrated about the lack of movement on things that they feel are very established as a risk, the building greenhouse blanket around the Earth. And I've watched him get more and more and more outspoken until he was really getting in the way of political forces in Washington, and just sort of keep at it. And he's in terrain that I think he recognizes now also can affect his credibility as a scientist to some extent. And I've written a lot about this question of when you're a scientist doing basic research in peer-reviewed journals, and then you step out and say, this is what I think you should do based on what I've just told you. That's a whole new role for science, and it's a very complicated one. But it happened with the atomic bomb. It's happened with global warming, and it makes you a target for a lot more heat, some of which is legitimate. So it's just been fascinating to watch him complexify and stay the same at the same time.
The person who I've got here tonight is speaking is Alberto Mora, who was the General Counsel of the Navy during the first, I guess, 6 years or so of the Bush administration. And to tell you the truth, when I heard that winning this award required us to bring somebody who we've written about who would say something nice about us, for an investigative reporter, that's not actually easy. I have a very large group of people. My parents are always joking about I could fill a room with people who hate me, but it's harder to find the ones that feel good about what I've written about them. So luckily there was Alberto Mora. He was one of the rare and amazing people inside the Bush administration who pushed back, stood up, understood the perils of the United States embracing torture completely, and it confronted Secretary of Defense Rumsfeld about it himself. And I did not know this when I started talking to Alberto Mora. What I knew was that I knew from some of the reporting I'd done that he was in some ways a kind of a secret inside dissident on the subject of torture. And then I saw in the Washington Post that he was leaving his job. And so this is one of the things that Cy Hirsch taught me, and others too, which is watch for who's leaving the administration, because then they can talk to you. So I made a beeline for him, and I had coffee with him, and he was only talking to me off the record. But as I talked to him, I realized he was just incredibly eloquent. And I thought, I have got to figure out some way to quote this man in the New Yorker, because he has an amazing story and an amazing voice. He was a Cuban immigrant to America, and the notion of the freedoms that were, guaranteed in the Constitution was not abstract to him. It was really concrete and very meaningful to him and his family. And so he was appalled on such a deep level about what was going on. So I then worked closely with him to try to bring him, just bit by bit to let me interview him. It also turned out that there were documents involved in this, and I had to get the documents. That's the other thing that Cy Hirsch will always say is, like, get the document. And So there was a secret memo that he had written to Rumsfeld warning him that what was going on was criminal. And while it took a long time to get Alberto to talk, at least with that document I could, get the story together. And it was 26 pages, and it was kind of a chronology of everything that had happened. So we wrote a story in the New Yorker called The Memo that was based on that, and it told his story. Anyway, it was just I feel lucky to have been able to kind of coax him into talking to us, and I'm really lucky to get him here tonight because, as I say, there aren't too many that would say such nice things. So.
Actually, I want to just add something about patience and sources, cultivating sources too. In 2005, when I wrote about this former oil lobbyist who was in the White House Environmental Quality Office rewriting climate reports, we knew I had written about some of the documents that he had been editing for several years. They would come out with all these waffle words that weren't there in the earlier version. But I never had something with his name on it or his handwriting. And as it turned out, a guy I met in 2002, so 3 years earlier, there was a guy working in the sort of climate science bureaucracy who kind of implied, someday there might be something I can give you. I can't do it now. When I leave government, blah, blah, blah. And so it took almost 3 years of sort of staying in touch with this person and being very patient and not pushing. And then I got this big fat FedEx Christmas present, and it made for quite a story. So patience does matter, and kind of knowing when to pull the trigger matters too.
How do you approach your sources in order not to put them into any danger, or if it's a very difficult subject that you don't want to make it obvious that your connection to them will put them in danger?
Me, I was just thinking about some of them, and it's complicated. I really worry about some of them, particularly the ones that became part of leak investigations. It can really ruin people's lives, and so I guess I just try very hard to, if I use, sometimes it's really tempting to use what they tell you in some way that will expose them, because it's such a good story, and you just have to not, basically, until you can figure out some way to protect them. You have to be patient or get them. One of the things I do often is if they can't speak, there's somebody in the book who I was not allowed to speak to, a man named Jim Clementi, who was an FBI agent down in Guantanamo, who had also been a lawyer, who was one of the people, the very first people to say, this is assault, it's abuse, it's criminal, I'm not doing it. And I had heard the story through other people, but the FBI wouldn't let me talk to him, and he's still in the FBI. So I had to figure out a cutout, a way that I've never spoken to him, but I've spoken to people who've spoken to him. And it's sort of a dodge, but at the same time, he can pass the polygraph test, he's never spoken to me. So sometimes you have to kind of be resourceful.
Yeah. When I was covering the explosion of me, and you find ways, right? You find ways. There was a metallurgist who was very helpful, and he was the one who kept saying, you know what, they keep talking bomb, but guess what? This stuff doesn't look like there's anything that happened that was forceful. It was stuff that ripped apart, not blew apart. And so again, you just sort of develop this sense of who you can trust. And then also, I think, and probably I'm sure you've done this, you make judgments based on the naivete or experience of the source in terms of how much you might press in sort of playing with something that you got. And so sort of like with libel law, if someone is, I'm sure you all learned about libel law, where if someone is not a public figure, there's a different standard than they are. And I think in sourcing, it's kind of the same thing. There are certain people you talk to in government who know the ropes, and then there are others who might be more naive, and you just have to tread more carefully.
One thing I was going to say also, though, I bet this was in my experience, almost everybody wants to talk. That's, at the end of the day, people who know something interesting or serious are really interested in telling their stories. So it's not like it takes some kind of, you don't have to waterboard them to get their stories out. So you just need to really listen.
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah, I really liked your book as well and the coverage of the issue. I guess you mentioned that sort of the main factor to propel this issue of reforms that's needed is public opinion, and I was wondering if you sort of foresee any particular sectors where this might bubble up or other examples, I don't know, to point to in terms of what might happen.
I mean, other than public opinion, what
Or-
would make
or-
a difference?
Yeah, or how public opinion might become more motivated on the issue, or I don't know.
You know, the kind of the human rights community, such as it is kind of militating in various ways to try to push for some sort of accountability. And my sense, though, is that at least what human rights lawyers are telling me is, if it doesn't happen in the U.S., it may happen elsewhere, surprisingly. Meaning that because there's universal jurisdiction, and other countries that also are signatories to the Torture Convention can bring charges against people in our country if they violated the laws. So I'm told that, you know, if Rumsfeld, for instance, is traveling in France, he might feel a tap on the shoulder and not be happy about it. So it might happen elsewhere before it happens here. There's actually a criminal trial beginning there's an criminal investigation beginning in London right now into the CIA, and there are about 24 CIA officers on trial in absentia in Italy right now for a rendition case.
This is a question for both of you. I'm interested in your experiences using the Freedom of Information Act and whether you've had good, bad, or how you would judge your experiences.
For me, bad. It's basically useless. There are organizations that seem very good at it. Greenpeace is really good at least in the environmental realm. But I've had no success because this administration, at least, has always found a way to point to stuff as deliberative, whatever you call it, where there's an out for a big. They have all these out clauses, and if you're not willing to really just sort of go to court and do all that, and for a lot of the things I'm writing on, at least most of the time, I've found another way to get what I needed, which is the other thing. I do think there are great stories out there waiting to be had that way, but I've had it hasn't been very useful for me, at least at the times. In my magazine life, there were some things I got that way that were useful.
Yeah, I consider myself kind of a failure at it. I would actually like to get better at it,
Me too.
but it's a tool I feel I don't use that well. The ACLU has gotten incredible stuff through FOIAs, and you know, so I've kind of dined off of their work, but I've had very little success. But I don't really know if it's the process or me. I think I just have not been that good, you know, figuring it out.
This question is more towards Andy. In the US, science journalism is fairly well developed, and most newspapers and magazines cover really complex topics. Coming from a place like India, where we hardly have any science journalism, most of it is very sensational. How does a journalist who's starting off deal with the audience who thinks science is just way too geeky? They don't want those complex topics. How do you address that? How do you bridge that barrier?
Well, to start, the audience that I write for is exactly the same. Most people see it as geeky, and whether they're in America or India or anywhere else. And so you have to, the best route in is just to find a good story. Often the story of science as a process is great. Whether it's in the Himalayas or up on the North Pole sea ice, there are things that happen that are purely human things. The scientists are, they're the closest thing the adult world has to kids, which means they're always making mistakes and always asking silly questions and breaking things and then making them better. So I guess the way in is just to tell the story of science, again, as a process, and you can have fun with that, and then stealthily get the actual information in. That's one way. There are other ways as well. I think just like the science of everyday life is so interesting. John Schwartz of the Times and Ken Chang do really good pieces on the science of cooking, or John went up in the Vomit Comet, the airplane where you can pretend you can be in free fall, basically zero G, and wrote some fun stuff. So there's all kinds of potential things. In India, didn't they just land something on the moon? I mean, right, there's some very cool stuff going on in developing countries too as well. And then, of course, there's tsunami. There's so many things to pursue that relate to people's lives as well, like the flying toilets. There's the science of health, and actually the science of washing hands. Hand washing is a revolutionary technique for avoiding contagion, and that can be written about, again, just from the basic thing, and then get into why it matters.
This question is also for Andy. It's about climate change coverage. It seems to me that there's been a shift recently between stories that allow some doubt as to whether human activities are causing climate change, and now they all seem to be, or for the most part, premised on the idea that, yes, it is us that's causing it, so you don't see the skeptics quoted as much. I'm wondering why you think that finally happened just in the past few years. It seems like scientists have been hoping that would happen for so long, and what was it that finally got that shift, and are you hopeful that might take us in good and fruitful directions?
Well, the problem with global warming is that the things that matter to people, like the rate of sea level rise in the next 75 years or so, still remain highly uncertain and highly contentious. The thing that has solidified powerfully and that there's no debate on is, guess what? Greenhouse gases actually do trap heat. Yeah, and the atmosphere gets warmer. The world already is getting warm in a way that can't be explained by other means. So it's highly likely that humans are the biggest force nudging the thermostat. But that's actually a really boring idea, just that we're warming the world. The things that matter, what's going to happen with hurricanes, how fast sea levels are going to rise, is the Arctic ice cap going to go on in 10 years, or will it kind of fluctuate more, like as opposed to what happened last summer? Hugely complex, lots of natural variability, impossible to get high confidence levels on the things that matter. So the first thing I say to people writing on this, whether they're practicing journalists or students, is just make sure you know what you're writing. What is this story today about? If it's about sea level, then you have to really characterize correctly that actually, there is a lot of dispute. There are scientists legitimately on both sides of how fast sea levels are going to rise. But again, that's not a reason to you have to include the context. You have to have at least one sentence in there saying, by the way, folks, this doesn't mean we don't know anything about global warming. And that's what gets really, I think the media overall the pendulum has swung too far toward this overly simplified idea that now we really know it. Now it's all going to hell in a handbasket. All the tipping points are being passed. And suppose the Arctic swings back the other way for a while. Then, how do you explain that? Unless you're honest in those particular realms to the complexities and the fact that there is some uncertainty, and that there are some PhDs out there who have legitimate arguments even about these things that matter. And by the way, the last thing that matters most, and this is why this issue is so hard to get public traction on, is regional climate change. What does this mean for Phoenix, or what does it mean for Bangladesh in terms of the monsoon? Those are the finer the grain, the harder the questions too. So again, that's what people really care about. They care about here. They care about now, and that's hard. So I don't have any confidence that I have a concern that people are oversimplifying it, and I have very little confidence that if you're correct in terms of characterizing the problem, that it would be the kind of problem we do well with. So there's more work to be done.
What you say about the complexity of the subject and how there's conflicting information is, I just wanted to say, very much also, the larger point is in journalism, no matter how much you might politically want something to be simple and back up your point of view, the responsibility is to get the complexity across and the material across that contradicts your point of view. And I found this true also in the stuff that I was working on with torture. The people who are against torture want to say it never works. It's not that it never works. It sometimes does work. And it's a kind of more complex issue about whether or not it gets you reliable information. Sometimes it even does, but at what cost? And I think you have to, your responsibility as a real journalist is, and not a propagandist, is to admit the information that contradicts even what you wish it didn't.
It's true. There are inconvenient truths on all sides of the global warming question.
Okay. Thanks so much.
Thank you all.